Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Life Science Rundown. This is Nicholas Capman with the FDA Group. Before we jump into our discussion for today, just a little bit about the FDA Group. We help life science companies in the areas of quality assurance, regulatory affairs, clinical operations, commissioning qualification and validation, CMC, as well as pharmacovigilance. We offer three different engagement models, which are consulting, staff augmentation, and full-time employee recruitment. So if you ever find yourself in need, just head over to the fdagroup.com to check us out and get in touch. So today I am speaking with Jen Chu. Hey, Jen, how are you?
Hi, I'm great. It's glad to be here.
All right, well, thanks for joining. And before we jump in today's topic, would you kindly introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm the Vice President of Solutions and Consulting for a supply chain specialist firm called Bristlecone. We're a global company and we focus on solving supply chain challenges for Global 2000 companies with a particular emphasis on life sciences organizations.
Okay, excellent. So, with your background, what is the topic we're going to be discussing today?
Yeah, we've been spending a lot of time talking about and with our clients around AI, and I thought it might be helpful to have a discussion about how life sciences companies can position themselves for growth, and the role that AI plays in that transformation.
Yeah, and it couldn't be a better time. Before we hopped on, we were just talking about some of the presentations we had heard on AI, and we know it can be really overwhelming with the amount of information. So what I'm hoping that we're going to be able to do today is for those individuals in supply chain that have been looking into AI, how can we take AI, their occupation, and put it together so that it's an easy and understandable thing that they can kind of move forward with?
Great. And it's probably not a one and done thing, right? It's probably not like, here's my job and here's AI. We stick it together and we're done, right? It's probably much more likely to be a multi-year, if not multi-decade journey as we get better with the technology, as the data gets better, as our organizational capacity improves. So it's one of the reasons why it's been so overwhelming for organizations is because there's a lot of pieces that have to pull together here.
That's right. So while we were preparing, we talked about this concept of great rethink in the healthcare supply chain. Can you talk a little bit about that and how Gen AI is comes into play?
Yeah, I mean, so every organization was hit obviously during COVID in ways that no one really outside of maybe some risk managers had really thought through and prepared for. But life sciences had an even bigger challenge, right? They had to help us solve the COVID crisis while employees were at home isolating, and so the amount of stresses on the life sciences organizations were just tremendous, and hopefully once in a generation or even less frequent than that. And so as we've come out of the crisis moment, organizations are still not totally settled back in. There's still studies going on around should hybrid be the model? Should everybody come back to work? There's a lot of CEOs out there that believe everybody should be back full time in the office. And so I think there's still a little bit of settling down around what the COVID term, the new normal really is going to be. We compound that complexity with AI, right? We now have this new capability being presented to us, especially with Chat GPT coming on and making it so much more accessible to not just the IT organization, but to everyone, whether you're a consumer or a middle manager or an intern, right? Or the CEO. And so it's really just made it a very complicated situation to go back to your opening premise that AI really is an overwhelming topic that companies have to solve for. So what we try to do is help companies think through, all right, so where should we start? What are the baseline that you need to have in place? What are sort of the stepping stones? What are the right use cases? And when you break it down like that, it demystifies a little bit of that AI journey for life sciences companies.
Let's start there. Let's start at a very high level and talk about the introduction of AI into the supply chain. And where would you like to start in terms of what people need to know?
Yeah, so first of all, we encourage everybody to think through a use case orientation. There's a lot of experimentation happening across your organization. Sometimes whether or not the IT department wants you playing with AI or not. And it's really been sort of a ground up technology. And so by forcing a sort of a use case mentality, it helps you to prioritize as an organization where you really can begin. So you want to think about the complexity, and you want to think about the strategic nature of the use case. So things that are simple and tactical, or what we could refer to as like intern work, they're
Mm,
probably easy to write a chatbot for, right? And automate, and it's a good way to learn. Things that are complex and strategic are probably not ready yet for AI. They may be your biggest bang use case, but not in 2024. Maybe, after you've got a few years of learning under your belt from your organization, and once you've gotten things like your data cleaned up and the right data made available, and once you started to meet the organizational challenges. So in addition to thinking about a use case perspective, we also encourage people to think about multiple use cases within an organization so that you can really build up some muscle memory, and some capability around how do you deploy and leverage AI as opposed to a scattershot all over the organization.
yeah. Um, I know there was a statistic I learned recently that right now 40% of jobs can be 30% more efficient with
Mm.
generative AI. So that's kind of the baseline statistic as of today. Now, when I thought about generative AI, I always thought, okay, it can help me write something. It can summarize something and things like that. We're starting to kind of move into, and I would say at least I'm moving into this, is the fact that it actually serve as a consultant. So you can ask it questions, kind of like a McKinsey consultant, and it'll actually give you or an answer.
Yeah.
Now, the what I've learned is that the effectiveness of that answer is dependent on how much information you're giving it, because it only can respond to the information that you put in. So if you put in minimal information, that's going to have an impact on the accuracy. And if you put a lot of information in, that accuracy is going to change. So has that been kind of your understanding and experience?
Absolutely. And in fact, if you were to rewind the podcast and listen about how I talk about AI, I consistently start with data, and then I move to the organization. And then there's hardware and software in the middle. And then finally there's the AI bot, or the, solution that you're designing. It is not an accident that I start every time with data and with organization. Because if you're not feeding it the right data set, then how in a regulated environment could you feel comfortable going to the FDA and saying this process is valid? I got 100% confidence that the answer that I am giving you, or the document that I am signing off on, is robust. And so
Mm,
you've got to have, especially in the regulated industries like life sciences, you have to have an outstanding and rigorous and robust data set from which to run your strategic sourcing operations, or for which to run your S&OP scenarios, or for which to run your logistics replanning, and your cold storage calculations, right? So it's generally probably not data that's willy-nilly out there on the internet, right? So I think these organizations are going to have to spend a lot of time thinking carefully around how to build and train the data sets on which they want to ask their McKinsey questions.
yeah. So there's different types of GPTs, and I've heard that's what these are actually called as GPTs, and I think it's generative programmable. I forget what the acronym stands for.
Heck, I think. But
Tech,
yeah, I don't,
maybe.
isn't it terrible? Like, it's like all of a sudden we're Xeroxing stuff again.
I know. We're right back to
Um,
Kleenex. Um, so I know there's different kinds. There's ChatGPT, Microsoft Copilot, Claude, Perplexity. and generally, I think are the top
Dozens of
five.
them, depending on the type of job that you want to do. So, for example, whenever I start to write a white paper or develop a PowerPoint deck, right, I'll feed an outline or maybe talk to a chat GPT in our enterprise. So we're protecting our data. And I'll start to bang out what that table of contents for a presentation would look like. And then I can actually have it rough up some slides. And
Hmm.
pretty soon, that saving, if you're just talking about pure productivity, which I think is where most AI use cases actually
Right
start,
now. Yeah.
right? Yeah. Then yeah, I have absolutely saved myself. I don't know exactly if you called it 30%, but 30 or 40%. Have I increased my own productivity by that much? Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it
Uh,
enables me to focus on like what is it uniquely that Bristlecone's bringing to the table, or that's unique about this particular client's supply chain challenge, as opposed to spending time, on fonts or the basic blocking and tackling of building the typical problem set, things like that. So it really does help you get to the meat of the issue.
hmm.
Um, so you get to um, uh, take advantage of getting the easy stuff out of the way and
Hmm.
standardized so that you can focus on the more strategic and the more complex.
Yeah, and I think when people start playing with GPTs, it's great to start with the free version to just understand kind of what it's doing. But I think as you start to become more dependent, there are subscriptions that you can pay for, which I think are generally in the $20 a month range. The way I've understood it is that there's a couple things you get. The first thing that you get is the latest version of the machine learning GPT.
Yeah.
So the free ones are going to be older versions and aren't going to be as up to date because we know it's machine learning as the paid subscriptions. The other thing that I understand that it provides is functionality. So it learns about you as an individual and possibly as an organization. And it also gives you control over different settings. So you mentioned, which is the truth to the vast majority of people listening, we're in a highly regulated environment. How comfortable are you going to be putting things into a GPT that's highly confidential? Well, there are functions where you can actually shut it off from the internet so that you don't have to worry about it seeping out onto the web.
Yeah, so that's what the enterprise version of ChatGPT
Yeah.
does, is it prevents anything that I load up in like building a scenario from being published, broadly to the internet. So it's also one of the things that companies I think are going to want to build or take advantage of service providers who are building bots. And because ChatGPT is still sort of, even though there's some functionality built into it, it's not a supply chain expert, right? It's not a new product introduction. It's not a clinical supply chain expert, right? The things that a life sciences company really needs in order to be differentiated. And so I do think that there is still and it's one of the reasons why AI hasn't been so broadly deployed yet. I mean, SAP is building out with Joule AI capabilities into its platform, but it's not broadly available yet, right? So because they're working with companies like ours to try to build up that AI capability in the supply chain in particular with us. But what we're working with is, we've built out a 78 use cases across the supply chain, and we're at different stages of maturity across each of those 78. But that way, individual companies don't have to go and say, okay, how do I teach the chat GPT bot to help me with strategic sourcing, right? That should be something that is probably unique to the way you operate as a life sciences organization. And there's also best practices around strategic sourcing that ChatGPT just hasn't really had a reason to care about up until now.
Yeah.
And so building these sort of specialized, digitized bots aimed at a particular intersection of industry and process, I think is where we're really going to start to see some material business benefit
Mm.
beyond the entry level sort of productivity, do what I do as a white collar business worker a little better, right?
Yeah. And I want to jump into the actual supply chain part of this. So the segue I want to put in is I know we talked about the five GPTs, but OpenAI actually is kind of the large language model wrap, as I understand it, that other companies are utilizing in order to make unique AI applications for specific uh, applications.
Yeah, I mean, simplify it, think about it as a service on top of a data set, right? So if OpenAI is the data set, right, what are the unique services that other companies are building?
Yeah. So I wanna kind of play a role play here. I'm in supply chain. I want to learn as much as I can about AI, and I'm bringing in Jen Chu. And I say, Jen, what do I need to know? Where do I start as it pertains to being able to use this? You mentioned 78 use cases. Where do you kind of start those conversations?
Yeah, so usually the conversation starts with, "Am I too late?" And right, that did I miss it? And the answer is no, you didn't miss it, right? And odds are that your organization has been experimenting, even if it wasn't like a formal project. Although we are starting to see organizations get more strategic and even seeing some AI COEs out there to try to capture all of that experimentation and structure it and build an actual roadmap strategically across all the different processes, not just supply chain. But we asked them to look at the major business processes that they have today, and we look at them on that simple two by two, the strategic from tactical to strategic, and from simple to complex. And by putting those cases into a two by two, you can pretty clearly start to see where there's some immediate near-term opportunity down in the simple and tactical, right? That's
Hmm,
your productivity range, right?
right,
Once you start either moving up on the strategic or over on the complexity,
right.
you're still probably going to want to have a human heavily involved, but
Oh
there may
yeah.
be an opportunity to have AI. There likely is an opportunity to have AI help you along the way, right? Things that are really truly strategic and complex, of which there are actually really very few when you think about it, right? But almost everything has some degree of tacticalness to it, or it can be
Mhm.
simplified in such a way. So there's a huge amount of opportunity in that human assisted AI capability range. But that's what we ask people to do is like, let's just start with a simple mapping so that you can wrap your head around where the right places to start. And then we do encourage folks to think about multiple opportunities within a single organization or within a single department so that you get some critical mass of learning
Mhm.
and you start to enable the organizational change component to build some momentum, right? Because this is not just a tech issue, right? This is a people, process, data, and technology issue. And if you spread your learnings out all over the place, it's hard to get that momentum going. But if we can think about, like, let's take the planning department, or let's take procurement, or let's take logistics, and like really learn our way through the handful of processes in those areas, it'll be much faster to apply those learnings. You'll start at a second level of maturity when you expand into other parts of the organization.
Yeah. And when you talked about moving into the kind of complex or strategic end of this, the two by two, um, the thing you mentioned, which I think is going to provide a lot of relief to people that want to get into AI but are concerned, is you're going to keep a human in the loop. So it's not a fully, I take everything it says, fully automated, anything like that. You're really challenging it to produce something that you need, but having that subject matter expert to review it to say, this is good. I really like this. They didn't hit the point on this one, so we're gonna adjust this and so on and so forth. So you're gonna have a human behind what this is creating to make that determination. How do you use that data?
Certainly in the near to medium term, humans are going to be heavily in the loop as
Mm,
we're learning, as both sides are learning, as the machine is learning and as we are learning. I mean, will we get to a point where we could push a button and run S&OP? Maybe, but I don't see that in any of the near term or medium term roadmaps that we're building for
yeah.
clients today.
Well, the other thing too is just in terms of becoming fully automated, by nature, GPTs are going to give you different information. each time you prompt it, and for the most part. So you actually wouldn't be able to validate it because you're not going to get the same result.
Right. And that's where going back to my little mental pyramid about AI, you got to have the data right. We have to be able to clearly define for the FDA what is in our data set. How did we train that data set? How did we test? How did we prove that the answers are real and not a hallucination? And obviously there, even with humans, there's variability in
Hmm.
answers. But you can go back and talk to that human. We have to have some sort of capability to go back and be able to validate the data in such a way that we can trust the answer or trace back in some reasonable way how we got to that answer. So
Yeah.
I do think human in the loop stays for an awfully long time in the regulated industries.
Okay. So I'm a supply chain person. I'm listening to this podcast and I'm saying I need to walk away with something tangible. Let's start on the simple and tactical end of the two by two. For those people that are listening, what are some simple tactical ways they can use Gen AI in supply chain?
Yeah, so everybody buys stuff, right? So we're all procurement experts, even if it's in our own consumer mind. So let's start with procurement because I think any of your listeners would be able to track on this one. If we think about some of the tactical activities that we do all the time in procurement, we send out an RFP and we get a
Mhm.
lot of data back. Why not have your digital assistant review those answers, structure the responses, and give a first pass grade to that RFP
Love it.
response. That's a pretty easy way to get started.
Yeah. Another thing is you can actually use the GPTs to help you find vendors.
That's right.
Uh,
So I would
uh,
move that up a notch into a
oh,
little
okay.
bit more strategic, right? Now,
Yeah.
it depends if you're just saying, oh, go find me everybody. Like if it's like the equivalent of an old Yellow Pages lookup for those of us of a certain age, then that's probably not strategic. But most strategic sourcing operations are far more in depth than an internet search. There's conversations, there's, RFIs, there's RFPs, there's
But it goes
site.
to your point about data,
Yeah,
right? So here are the qualifications I have for vendors that I want to consider. So if you can pump that information into the GPT and say, okay, now you know what my qualifications are in order to consider a vendor who meets these qualifications.
you got it. Yep.
Yeah. And
And I
so
would
that can
move that
save you a
up.
lot of time.
Yeah, I would move that up into a little bit more strategic because you're still going to want to have a human go through and validate that data. Probably you may not find a single vendor that meets all of your,
Mhm.
preferred criteria. So now you've got to get in and start weighting things or say, okay, well, they don't have this but that's okay. We can work with them on that, right? So you start
Yeah.
to need to have some strategic discussions with your potential vendors.
And in the GPT, you can say this is required, this is a nice to have. So you can actually break it up. The other thing is GPTs understand misspellings. So if you misspell something, it's not the end of the world. They understand acronyms and they understand what do you call it? Phrases that don't translate well from a computational
Yeah.
standpoint, like you know, six in one hand, half a dozen in the other, they understand that type of terminology.
Yeah, but even the acronyms, I would say when you get into some really high-end sourcing for a unique reagent or something, maybe there's a case where we actually need to train, the digital assistant
Yeah,
to
right.
say, XYPDQ means X, whatever it is, and spell it out. Just save a few iterations and a few false starts, and that's the learning that as we start to work more regularly with these digital assistants, with these bots, they'll get smarter because we won't have to tell them multiple times what those acronyms mean, and we'll know right off the bat. I need to provide this additional piece of training, right, when I ask the question.
Yeah. All right. So I've learned from a procurement standpoint, I can have it summarize and grade my RFPs. I can tell it the qualifications I need for vendors and have it send me a list. Let's continue with some other use cases, and then I want to move eventually to a point about the bigger picture, because now we're talking about just not simple tactical
Yeah.
pieces, but if I really want to make this a larger project, what are those steps that I need to take? But before we get there, what are some other use cases that somebody could quickly and efficiently be able to, implement today?
Yeah, so I'll start on a few other simple ones. Namely, I would think in the logistics and distribution space, calculating alternate routes or sourcing out of different distribution centers. You see a hurricane coming in Florida, you've got a big facility in Orlando. And so maybe for a few days, you want to temporarily, work around that Orlando facility because they're going to be busy with other things for a few days. Those are great, like logistics specific redeployment on the fly activities that you can do with these bots. But the 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 real big one that we want to be able to get to is all of the S&OP planning, right? That's the when you talk about that two by two and you're thinking about complex and strategic, to be able to get to a point where I could run sales and operations planning without weekly, monthly, quarterly sessions without having to put 30 people in a room. I don't know if but I mean, that's what happens in a lot of S&OP sessions. We've got people from finance, people from sales, people from supply chain, and people from manufacturing. Very expensive, costly resources. We pull them
Mm,
out of the business for several days. They sit in a conference room and they run planning.
right.
Like, that's hugely complex and hugely strategic. If we can get to a point where those same resources already have a number of scenarios that have been pre-run and say, what if this happens? What if this happens? What if this happens? What if this happens?
Mhm.
And then we're left with sort of responding to those scenarios with some very specific advice and guidance, then we can get that S&OP down from a 2 or 3 day session to a 3 or 4 hour session. Maybe it can
Mm,
finally all be really virtualized because a lot of these companies are still getting together at headquarters and running that. Although we are seeing hybrid S&OP, so I don't want to the whole business case isn't on avoiding travel, but to go from 3 or 4 days of S&OP preparation and execution down to 3 or 4 hours of preparation and execution, because we've offloaded so much of that scenario planning onto a well-trained bot. That is what will make, because we need the answers will hopefully be better, right? We'll get to a more optimized set of results and we'll do it in less time.
yeah. So let's say I'm an executive. I'm responsible for quarterly and annual meetings, and what you just said hit home with me. Say, yeah, that's exactly what I do, and to be honest, that's what I do. So how do I take that first step in trying to become more productive so that I can shorten the amount of time people are working on the business instead of in the business?
Yeah. Well, a lot of reason why those S&OP meetings are 3 or 4 days long is because people are having to go back and validate the data. And so making sure that that's why we say start in that lower left-hand corner of simple and tactical, because you still have to have your data right. It's just not as risky if it's wrong, right? Like because it's contained. And so as we build from that lower left-hand corner up into the human assisted and eventually up into the nirvana of a push button S&OP, it allows us to start to clean and train and build the right data sets in order to do that. By also starting in that lower left-hand corner, we start to build the organizational change muscle on how to work with the different digital assistants, on how to work with the bots, on how to train them, on how to interpret the results, how to quickly run a new set of prompts to refine the data. You don't want to be learning that on S&OP with, 7 or 8 vice presidents in the room. You want to learn it with a couple of managers and interns in the room and build that organizational capacity. So that's why we look at building a roadmap, taking that use case perspective, building a reasonable roadmap, using those to build our data and our organizational capabilities.
Yeah, and I think it's important, and this is, it's funny because we already know this from other examples in life, but sometimes we forget what we've learned, right? Which is it's crawl before you walk, and
Yes.
then walk before you run. So we're not going to go from I don't know what GPT stands for, and you and I don't either, although we think we know what it means, right? But to, hey, I'm going to implement this across the whole organization. right? So we have to start, in the lower left-hand corner before we move up to the upper right-hand corner.
You,
Um,
you started this conversation with, it's overwhelming, right? Well, break it down. Any big complex problem, you don't solve the big complex problem on day one, right? You break it down into smaller subsets of challenges that you can meet and you learn from, and then you build to the next level and you build to the next level. So that's exactly the right way to think about taking advantage of AI.
yeah. Now, how would people know if they're ready to set up a roadmap for implementing OAI in a more complex and strategic manner? How do they know if they're ready for that?
Well, I would say everybody needs to be planning for it, whether or not they're putting a massive team in place and tackling a dozen different use cases across different parts of the organization, or whether or not they're starting with one. But I almost every Global 2000 that we work with is doing something in AI today. I'd say if they haven't started thinking about it, they're behind. But I also would bet that there are people in the organization who have been experimenting on the side, even if they don't know about it.
Hmm.
So whether that's a glass half full or glass half empty, I don't know. But there are people in the organization that have likely been touching AI in one capacity or another. I mean, the data is showing that. I think there was only uh, I'll have to go back and find the source for you. But it was only like 2% of Global 2000 companies had totally locked off all access to Chat GPT, all AI. Everybody else has some degree of limited access, even if it's to an enterprise version that's not allowing things to get thrown out onto the general internet. So I think most large companies have at least started to tiptoe into the water.
Hmm.
Now, whether or not they build a strategic roadmap, that is probably the early adopters who've really sat down and put a method to the madness and said, here's how we're going to start. We're going to build here. We're going to learn from this, and then we'll slowly expand. So I think there's still time for companies to start. I do hear a few companies say, I'll just wait for SAP to figure it out. That's too late.
Yeah,
Will say is too little, too late. You will be outcompeted by them.
yeah.
That's
Well,
not to say that SAP is not going to bring some very valuable, capabilities and build in stuff
mm,
that you don't have to then, worry about. Some of the basic transactional processing may not be some of your first use cases, but I would always recommend that you've got to build some organizational capacity to learn around AI, and not just wait for SAP to do it for you.
I think that's the bittersweet aspect of this is it's not too late and you need to start,
Yes, thank you.
right?
You said it much more succinctly than I did.
Right. And the other analogy I would use as it pertained to your SAP comment, right, is that type of comment. It almost seems to me like somebody that's going to be running an organization saying, I don't need my MBA. I'll just hire people that know these different functions,
Hmm.
which I would say is not sufficient. It doesn't mean you need an MBA, but what it does mean is you need to understand what's a balance sheet. How do I do a capital raise? What is a sales process? What are the fundamentals of supply chains? Yes, AI is going to help you. Yes, SAP is going to come out with something. And yes, you actually need to learn and understand what this does. Doesn't mean you have to be a subject matter expert, but you
Right.
do need a baseline of understanding.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah,
So I think the SAP, it will be complementary to the early adopters, and it will be hopefully in the nick of time for those who are just waiting on their enterprise application vendor to do it for them.
yeah. So let's do some predictions.
Hmm.
Okay.
Okay.
What's coming in the future? And maybe we'll use short-term future. What can people expect coming in 2025? And what types of actions would you recommend that they take in order to make sure that they don't fall behind?
Yeah, massive amounts of data projects are in the near and medium term horizon, because doing any of these AI calculations on top of bad data just gets you bad answers faster. So I think the data and analytics piece is just skyrocketing, right?
Hmm.
And so if you don't already have a project to optimize your data, to clean up your data, to determine whether or not you've even got the right data to answer the types of questions that you want to be able to ask your digital supply chain assistant, then you're behind, right? And so I think in the next, 6, 12, 18 months, data will be king.
I couldn't agree with you more. Um, Data is going to become the new currency. And I think there's going to be a shift. I think once we as a society understand the power of data, I think to an extent it's going to become less accessible. I think people are going to see the power in their data and say, you know what, I'm not willing to share this.
Yep. I think there will be a
And
kernel of, the language, the large language models that you referred to earlier. They're broadly trained through this OpenAI or through other, large organizations, and that's good. But everybody's got access to all that data. So how do you
Mhm.
stand out as a large life sciences company? You have to append your own unique data. Now there's industry specific data, the rules and regulations and then there's your organization's unique data. So that sort of bullseye, right, from most strategic, the smallest amount, but the most important, all the way out to the internet, OpenAI data, for example. It takes that combination of company, industry, and common data to get us to the right answers when we're running our super duper S&OP process one day. But yeah, that core of data becomes your organization's gold mine.
Yeah. Now, these podcasts are not commercials. And what I will say is, I'm a supply chain person. I've been listening to this podcast. I understand generally what AI can do. I'm excited about its ability to help me in my function, become more productive, and even work on more strategic things. I'm ready to go. Okay. Um, how can your organization help these companies? What would that look like?
Yeah, so we often start with an assessment, try to help them prioritize which area has the richest set of opportunities, or we start right from our listed use cases and we start to prioritize, plot our use cases against their specific, scenarios, and we build out a roadmap. We figure out for that roadmap what data, what process, what people, and what technology activities need to take place. And we just start setting up the pins and knocking them down.
Yep. Awesome. Well, I think this was a really good podcast. I think we left the audience with some nuggets that they're going to be able to take back and implement pretty quick. What would you like to leave the audience with before we close?
Yeah, I would say don't be afraid to get started. Everybody's going to stub their toes here at the beginning, and that's part of the learning process. But I would discourage anyone from just waiting and see what shakes out because AI is here. AI is getting adopted, and it's just a matter of how fast your company is going to be able to take advantage of this new capability.
Yeah. And I would, I've actually used this analogy. I'm a man of a million analogies. The AI meteor has hit the Pacific. So even though the sun is shining on Santa Monica Beach, you better get moving, right? So that's how I look at it. Jen, thank you so much for your insight. This was really great. And to everybody listening, as always, if you find conversations like this valuable, please share it with a colleague or your professional network. If you haven't already, subscribe to get updates of new episodes at thefdagroup.com/podcast and follow the FDA Group on LinkedIn. If you'd like to connect about project or resource needs, head over to thefdagroup.com to get in touch, or feel free to connect with me personally on LinkedIn. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we will see y'all next time.